Imagine it's 1st December 2001. You are a 42-year-old hardware store owner living in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Your apartment is above the shop, on a noisy street where buses rattle past your window before sunrise, and the smell of coffee climbs up from the corner cafe every morning. You keep your savings in a bank 2 blocks away, mostly in dollars, because everyone says dollars are safe and the peso is as good as the dollar anyway. Your wife handles the books at the kitchen table every Sunday night, your son studies in the back room, and your biggest worry is whether builders will keep buying nails, paint, and copper wire through the summer. The shelves are full, the rent is paid, the lights work. The future feels narrow, maybe, but solid, like a door that still closes cleanly in its frame. If you have ever wondered why nations can spend years looking stable right before everything breaks, stay with me. What you're about to hear is not a theory, it is a pattern. It has happened before. And it almost never ends gently. And if you find value in this kind of historical clarity, subscribing takes 2 seconds and keeps you ahead of what most people never see coming. Then, the doors of the bank do not really close, not at first. They open, but only partly. The government announces the corralito, a cage around your own money, and cash withdrawals are limited to 250 pesos a week. That is when the floor drops. Customers stop buying. Suppliers demand cash. The dollars on your bank statement are still there on paper, but paper is now the problem. Within weeks, protests fill the streets, at least 20 people are killed in the unrest, presidents come and go in a blur, and by the middle of 2002, the peso that had been fixed 1-to-1 with the US dollar has crashed to nearly 4-to-1. You did not cause this. Your neighbors did not cause it. The school teacher, the taxi driver, the pensioner, the nurse, the man selling bread from the kiosk at the corner, none of them created the debt that buried the country. But they lived where the avalanche finally landed. That is what this video is about. The debt spiral that no country has ever escaped without pain. Not because debt always ends in apocalypse, it does not. Countries can borrow, grow, rebuild, and recover. But when debt grows faster than the economy that must carry it, when old debt is paid with new debt, when banks, governments, and central banks become tied together like climbers roped to the same failing anchor, history shows that the exit is never clean. Someone pays. Usually many people pay. Often the people who understood the system the least. Before we go further, there is something important to understand. A debt spiral is not just a country owing money. Every country owes money. The danger begins when the cost of carrying that debt rises faster than the country's ability to earn, tax, export, or grow. Think of it like a farmer who borrows seed for next year's crop. If the harvest grows faster than the debt, the loan was a bridge. But if drought hits, prices fall, and the farmer borrows again just to cover the last loan, the debt stops being a tool and becomes a trap. At the national level, the trap works in slow motion. Governments borrow to pay for war, welfare, wages, pensions, imports, subsidies, or simply to keep the machine quiet for one more year. If investors begin to doubt repayment, interest rates rise. That means more tax money goes to creditors instead of roads, hospitals, schools, or electricity. Growth slows. Slower growth makes the debt look even bigger. Banks get nervous because they hold government bonds. People get nervous because they hold bank deposits. Money starts running for the exits. Sometimes into dollars, sometimes into gold, sometimes into real estate, canned food, fuel, or anything that cannot be printed. Then comes the fork in the road. The government can cut spending hard. That is austerity, which means taking money out of the economy when the economy is already weak. It can default, which means openly saying it cannot pay as promised. It can print money, which can shrink debt in name but destroy savings in real life. It can freeze deposits. It can impose capital controls, meaning limits on how fast money can leave the banking system. It can ask for rescue loans, which often come with conditions so painful they feel like rescue from a burning house by moving into a colder one. The important thing is this: there is no painless button. Once the spiral is mature, the country is no longer choosing between pain and no pain. It is choosing where the pain lands, on savers or debtors, on workers or pensioners, on importers or taxpayers, on today or tomorrow. Collapse is rarely a lightning strike. It is more like a ceiling beam taking water for years. One day the room looks normal. The next day the plaster is on the floor. This brings us directly to the first part of the story. The debt spiral often begins with a promise that the rules of money have changed forever. In Germany after the First World War, that promise sounded different from Argentina's, but the trap underneath was the same. The government had borrowed heavily during the war instead of raising enough taxes. After defeat in 1918, Berlin faced domestic war debt, huge social spending, and reparations demanded by the victors in gold-backed currency. The state had bills due in hard money while its economy was weak and its politics were broken. At first, the answer was delay. Delay dressed up as policy. The government borrowed more from the Reichsbank, the central bank, and more banknotes poured into the system. That worked for a while because inflation can feel like movement. Shops are busy. Debts shrink in real terms. Some businesses even look healthier because their liabilities, their money they owe, are being eaten alive by rising prices. Research on the period shows that highly indebted German firms saw leverage, meaning debt compared with assets, collapse by more than 50% between 1919 and 1924. For the state, inflation was a hidden knife cutting through old obligations. By the time the Rentenmark replaced the old mark in November 1923, the sum of German war debt, once valued at 154 billion marks, had effectively shrunk to 15.4 Pfennig. But that apparent solution was really a transfer, a silent confiscation. The state and debtors were being rescued by destroying the claims of savers, wage earners, and anyone living on fixed income. Before the war, $1 bought just over 4 marks. By November 1923, it bought 4.2 trillion. By July 1922, prices had already risen around 700%. In many places, wages were paid daily because weekly pay became absurd. Workers ran from factories to shops, carrying notes in bags and suitcases, trying to swap paper for goods before the paper melted further. Traders raised prices constantly. Some sold only for food or coal. Others simply shut their doors. Imagine being a clerk in Berlin in late 1923. You're not speculating. You're not betting on currencies. You're trying to buy soup, shoes for your daughter, maybe coal for the stove. But the price of lunch changes between ordering and eating. Savings that took 20 years to build vanish faster than rain on a hot stone. Pensioners starve. Farmers refuse to sell into cities for useless paper. Food riots break out. Townspeople raid the countryside. And because money no longer works as a measuring stick, everything else begins to warp with it. Trust shrinks. Anger expands. Conspiracy theories grow in the dark like mold behind wallpaper. Now here is the part many people miss. Weimar Germany was not just a story of reckless printing. It was a story of debt that could not be carried honestly. Reparations, domestic obligations, political weakness, and a refusal to match spending with taxation all fed the blaze. Printing money was not the fire itself. It was the gasoline poured on a house already full of smoke. It relieved one burden by shifting it onto the public. The government escaped nominal debt, debt in face value, by making the currency itself unfit to store value. Who won? Not many ordinary people. Borrowers with fixed debts gained. Some industrial firms with real assets gained for a time. Owners of land, inventory, and foreign currency were in a far better position than salaried households holding cash. But even many temporary winners were standing on melting ice because the wider economy was collapsing around them. By 1923, unemployment surged toward 30%. This is the lesson from Germany's first great debt spiral of the 20th century. A country can reduce debt by destroying its currency. It cannot do so without destroying social trust at the same time. Here is something I want you to think about before we go further. When a state becomes trapped, which is safer in history, the promise printed on paper or the thing people need, even if the paper fails, drop your answer in the comments. Seriously. Because what I am about to show you next is the part of this story that most people never hear, and it changes everything. This leads us to the second part of the story. Sometimes the pain does not arrive as hyperinflation. Sometimes it arrives as a locked bank door in a modern country using a modern currency, with debit cards, ATMs, and television anchors still speaking in calm voices. That was Greece. For years after joining the euro in 2001, Greece could borrow cheaply. Cheap debt can feel like a tailwind even when you're already drifting toward rocks. Public spending rose fast. Public sector wages climbed about 50% between 1999 and 2007. The 2004 Athens Olympics added cost and prestige in the same gesture, like polishing the brass on a ship taking on water below deck. When the global financial crisis hit in 2008, the country's weak tax base, large deficits, and high debt were suddenly impossible to hide. By the final quarter of 2014, Greek debt had climbed to around 174% of GDP, the highest in Europe. The economy had already been crushed. Between 2008 and 2014, output fell by roughly 26%. Unemployment climbed above 27% at its peak, and youth unemployment was far worse. Imagine an entire generation staring at adulthood through a shop window they could not enter. Then, in 2015, the standoff with creditors reached the point where private fear became public theater. On 28 June 2015, after the European Central Bank kept emergency liquidity assistance to Greek banks capped, the Greek government imposed capital controls and called a bank holiday. Cash withdrawals were limited to 60 euros a day, not because cash machines had suddenly become fragile metal boxes, but because trust had become the scarce resource. On 3rd June, Greece missed a 1.6 billion euro payment to the IMF, the first developed country to do so. In August, a third bailout worth up to 86 billion euros was approved. Listen carefully to what this means for ordinary life. If you were a cafe owner in Thessaloniki, your problem was not a chart about sovereign spreads. Your problem was whether your supplier would accept transfer or cash. If you were a retiree in Athens, your problem was not a debate in Brussels. Your problem was standing in an ATM line in summer heat, wondering whether 60 euros would cover medicine, groceries, and the bus home. If you were a parent, your children could hear the word bailout and think it meant help, while you knew it meant another round of tax increases, wage pressure, and uncertainty. And this is where history gets uncomfortable. Greece did not inflate its debt away like Weimar Germany. It could not. It did not control the currency in which much of the burden was effectively anchored. So the pressure landed elsewhere, on wages, on employment, on public services, on time itself. A debt spiral can break people through prices. Greece shows it can also break them through stagnation, meaning years of no growth, no relief, no release. It was like being crushed not by an explosion, but by a tightening vice. Notice the mechanism. Easy borrowing creates illusion. Growth slows. Debt looks larger. Creditors demand conditions. Conditions weaken the economy further. The weaker economy makes the debt harder to bear. Then the banks become part of the story because they sit between the state and the public, holding government debt on one side and household savings on the other. Once the public doubts the banks, the crisis stops being abstract. It enters the kitchen. There is another hard truth here. Rescue packages do not rescue everyone equally. They often rescue the system first. That can be necessary. A banking collapse is not a moral lesson anyone wants to live through. But system rescue and social rescue are not the same thing. The bridge may be saved while the passengers are told to keep swimming. Greece kept the euro. It avoided a sudden monetary rupture, but the cost was years of compressed incomes, high unemployment, and a deep sense among ordinary citizens that the ledger had been balanced on their backs. Look at what happened next in a different part of the world, and the pattern becomes even clearer. Argentina's crisis at the turn of the century had different language, different institutions, different politics, but the same rope was tightening. In the 1990s, Argentina fixed the peso to the US dollar 1-for-1. For a while, the peg killed inflation and created trust. That trust brought capital in. Borrowing grew. But a fixed exchange rate is like wearing a suit of armor in a swimming pool. It protects you right until it makes movement impossible. By the late 1990s, recession hit. Prices were falling slightly, which sounds pleasant until you remember that debts do not fall with them. Deflation, which means prices dropping across the economy, can make debt heavier because incomes fall while obligations stay fixed. Argentina entered the 2000s with shrinking output, falling confidence, and growing dependence on new borrowing. By the end of 2001, the country was cornered. The government defaulted on roughly $81 billion of debt, the largest sovereign default in history at that time. Output fell about 20% over 3 years. Unemployment rose above 20%. The public debt ratio more than doubled from 63% of GDP at the end of 2001 to about 135% by the end of 2002. What ordinary people remember, though, is not the ratio. They remember the cage. The Corralito limited cash withdrawals to 250 pesos a week. Later came the corralón, a bigger freeze on time deposits. Dollar savings were trapped. Then came asymmetric pesoization, a clumsy conversion system under which different assets and liabilities were turned into pesos at different rates. In plain English, rules changed after the game had already started. The social damage was brutal. World Bank assessments found urban poverty rising to roughly 53% in 2002. Real wages plunged. Small businesses that had survived recession could not survive a system where suppliers demanded one kind of money, customers held another, and banks offered neither. Buenos Aires looked at moments like a city arguing with itself in every direction at once. Middle-class families banged pots in the street. Neighbors organized barter clubs. Store owners slept badly because they no longer knew whether they were illiquid, meaning short of ready cash, or insolvent, meaning truly ruined. In a crisis, those two feelings can look identical at 3 a.m. Yet Argentina also reveals something strange and counterintuitive. After the default and devaluation, parts of the economy eventually recovered faster than many outsiders expected. Exporters became more competitive. Agricultural producers selling into world markets suddenly had an advantage in a much cheaper currency. That does not erase the pain. It proves the point. The spiral ended, but not without massive losses first. The bridge collapsed before a new road was built. Most people will never know what you now know. Most people will keep trusting systems they do not understand. If you are still here, you are not most people. Hit subscribe, because the next section is the part this channel was made for, the part they never put in textbooks. Now observe what all of these cases have in common. Different countries, different decades, different currencies, different ideologies, same mechanism. In Germany, the state used inflation to crush debts that could not be honored in stable money. In Greece, external financing in the banking system kept the structure standing, but only by shifting the burden into years of unemployment, capital controls, and austerity. In Argentina, a rigid exchange rate promise broke under the weight of recession and debt, and the damage came through default, deposit freezes, devaluation, and poverty. The same machine. 3 different exits, none painless. A debt spiral is like a room with 3 doors, and all of them open onto weather. One door leads to inflation, one to default. One to stagnation under external supervision. Sometimes a country uses all 3 in sequence or in combination. But there is no hidden 4th door marked normal life. This is why debates during crises are so often misleading. One side says print, another says cut, another says restructure, another says hold the peg, another says leave the currency union. These are real choices. They matter. But by the time they dominate the conversation, the underlying loss has usually already happened. The country has consumed more claims than the economy can honor at face value. The only remaining question is who recognizes the loss, when, and in what form. The same mechanism also explains why debt crises infect banks so quickly. Governments sell bonds. Banks buy them. Citizens trust banks. Citizens also trust the state, or they used to. When the state weakens, bank balance sheets weaken. When banks weaken, deposits become suspect. When deposits become suspect, people run. Then governments intervene to save the banks they themselves helped endanger. The serpent is eating its own tail. It also explains why slogans like strong currency, international support, investor confidence, or orderly adjustment can all be true and still hide pain. A stable exchange rate can delay panic while making imbalances worse. International support can prevent sudden collapse while deepening a long squeeze. Investor confidence can return before household confidence does. Orderly adjustment can be orderly on spreadsheets and brutal on city blocks. Now look at all 3 together, and one more thing appears. Timing matters. Debt spirals do not explode at the moment debt becomes high. They explode when refinancing becomes doubtful. That is why countries can look stable for years while rotting underneath. The rot is in the beams, not on the paint. Argentina looked fixed until it wasn't. Greece stayed inside the euro until the ATM lines formed. Germany's inflation built in stages before money itself stopped working. At this point, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The last stage of the spiral is not really economic, it is social. Money is memory. Savings are stored time. A pension is a promise from your younger self to your older self. When a debt crisis breaks those links, it does more than reorder accounts. It tells millions of people that the future they thought they bought has been repossessed. So who gets hurt the most when this happens? History is unusually clear on that question. The first casualties are often the people who did the respectable thing, the saver, the pensioner, the salaried worker, the small business owner who kept cash for payroll, the family that trusted the bank because every normal society tells them to trust the bank. In Weimar Germany, pensioners and cash savers were devastated because their claims were fixed while prices ran wild. The state's burden shrank, their lives did not. In Greece, wage earners, the unemployed, and the young paid through years of lost opportunity. A whole stretch of productive life was squeezed flat, like a field after a flood. In Argentina, the urban middle class learned that a bank balance and access to that balance are not the same thing. In Lebanon after 2019, ordinary depositors found that out in even harsher form. The country's crisis, described by the World Bank as one of the most severe globally since the mid-19th century, saw GDP plunge from about $55 billion in 2018 to about $33 billion in 2020. Inflation averaged 84.3% in 2020. More than half the population fell below the poverty line. Banks imposed informal capital controls, which means restrictions without a clean legal framework, and depositors found their dollar savings trapped as the currency collapsed. Picture the human texture of that. A family needing surgery but unable to withdraw enough money for the hospital. A shop with shelves half empty because imports require hard currency. Teachers leaving, doctors leaving, electricity failing, medicines vanishing. Debt crises are often described with words like restructuring, liquidity, and sustainability. For ordinary people, they are felt as darkness, delay, and humiliation. Now here is where it gets interesting. Not everyone loses the same way. Those with claims fixed in local currency are usually weakest when inflation does the work. Those with large uninsured bank deposits are exposed when banking rescue becomes the priority. Cyprus proved that with shocking clarity in 2013. As part of its rescue, uninsured depositors above 100,000 euros at Bank of Cyprus lost 47.5% through a bail-in, which means their deposits were converted into bank equity to absorb losses. At Laiki Bank, uninsured depositors were effectively wiped out in the resolution. Insured deposits under 100,000 euros were protected. Same crisis. Different outcomes depending on where you stood in the legal structure. That detail matters because debt spirals are not only battles over economics, They are battles over hierarchy. Who gets paid first? Which promises are sacred? Which promises are expendable? The law becomes a sorting machine. People who thought they owned safe assets discover they owned a place in line. And the line is not fair. Households with political access, foreign accounts, overseas income, or real assets often come through better than households tied entirely to domestic wages and domestic banks. In Argentina, exporters and landowners selling into world markets recovered sooner than urban salary earners whose savings had been trapped. In Lebanon, those with access to fresh dollars from abroad were better protected than those earning in local currency inside the broken system. In every case, mobility mattered, flexibility mattered. Being less trapped inside the official promise mattered. The question is not whether this pattern will repeat. History has already answered that. The only question is whether you will see it before it sees you. If this channel helps you think differently about the world you live in, subscribe. It costs nothing, and it might change everything. The historical record also shows that those who came through these periods relatively intact largely shared a few characteristics. Not because they were geniuses, not because they predicted every turn, but because they understood one brutal rule. When a system built on confidence starts feeding on itself, flexibility is worth more than certainty. First, survivors were rarely overcommitted to a single official promise. In Weimar Germany, people holding only cash or fixed pensions were exposed in the most direct way. Those with land, inventory, foreign currency, or businesses able to reprice quickly had some shield, however imperfect. In Argentina, families and firms with diversified income, export earnings, or assets outside the trapped banking channel had more room to move. In Lebanon, diaspora connections and access to fresh dollars became a lifeline. History does not say there is one magic asset. It says concentration kills. Second, survivors adapted early, before the crowd. Not because they had better morals, but because debt spirals punish delay. When confidence breaks, the value of speed rises. The first households to cut leverage, extend supplies, build alternative income, or move liquid savings into forms that matched local reality were often the ones who preserved choice. Choice is the real scarce good in a crisis. Once everyone is running for the same narrow exit, even good decisions become impossible. Third, survivors understood the difference between price and value. During inflation, a number can rise while your real position falls. During deflation and austerity, a bank statement can look unchanged while your ability to use that money shrinks. During deposit freezes, $1 in an account and $1 in your hand stop being the same thing. People who lived through these episodes learn to ask harder questions. Not what something is worth on paper, but what it can buy, where it can move, and under which rules it exists. Fourth, and this is easy to miss, social capital mattered. That means trust between people, families with strong networks, communities that could barter, businesses with loyal suppliers, immigrants who could send remittances, neighbors who could share transport, fuel, or childcare. These soft forms of support often mattered as much as formal wealth. When the official map stops matching the ground, human relationships become an unofficial currency. None of that is financial advice. It is historical pattern recognition. The point is not to romanticize collapse. Collapse is not a cleansing storm. It is an amputation done without enough anesthesia. The point is to notice that the people who suffer most are usually the people who believe the system will behave tomorrow exactly as it behaved yesterday. And that brings us back to the wider world now, not as prophecy, as rhyme. The IMF has warned that global public debt is expected to exceed $100 trillion, around 93% of world GDP in 2024. Wang Tadi says developing countries' net interest payments on public debt reached $921 billion in 2024. With 61 developing countries spending more than 10% of government revenue just on interest. That does not mean every country is heading for a cliff. It means the old historical pressure is visible again. Slower growth, higher borrowing costs, weak politics, populations aging in some places and demanding more support in others, more promises, less room. The danger signs are familiar. Governments leaning on short-term fixes. Central banks asked quietly or loudly to carry burdens that belong to politics. Banking systems still tied closely to sovereign debt. Citizens told that the problem is temporary, technical, manageable, contained. Sometimes that is true. Sometimes the house is merely settling. But history whispers the same warning every time. When debt service begins to compete with the basic functions of the state, the fight is no longer over arithmetic. It is over social order. So let us return to Buenos Aires, to that hardware store above the noisy street. In the weeks after the Corralito, you go downstairs and open the shutters anyway. Some customers come in angry, some come in scared, some paying cash. Some ask for credit, some want to barter. The shelves thin out, the prices change. Your savings, which once looked like a wall between your family and uncertainty, turn out to be a curtain. You survive, perhaps. Many did, but not unchanged. Maybe you learn to distrust any system that promises stability without sacrifice. Maybe you keep less faith in official pegs, neat ratios, and polished speeches. Maybe you understand, now in your bones, that debt is not dangerous because numbers get large. Debt becomes dangerous when a nation starts borrowing not to build the future, but to keep the present from admitting what it has already lost. That is the final lesson. No country has ever escaped a mature debt spiral without pain because a mature debt spiral is already pain, only not yet distributed. The losses are there before the headlines arrive. Inflation distributes them one way. Default distributes them another. Austerity and stagnation distribute them another. Bank restructurings and capital controls distribute them another. But distribute them they will. History does not tell us exactly what comes next in any one country. It does tell us what to watch. Watch the gap between promises and productive capacity. Watch whether debt is financing growth or merely postponing recognition. Watch whether banks and states are becoming too entangled to fail separately. Watch whether rescue plans protect society or only the machinery above it. And above all, watch the ordinary person. The queue at the ATM, the pension bought with a week's wages, and then a day's wages, and then an hour's wages. The shopkeeper who cannot use the money he supposedly has. That is where the truth of a debt spiral always appears first. This is historical and educational analysis. It is not financial advice. Every individual situation is different. Please consult a qualified professional before making any financial decision. This video is not for everyone. Most people will dismiss it. But if one person in your life needs to hear this, share it with them, not because it will change the world, because it might change their world. Subscribe for more, and I will see you in the next one.